Thank you so much, Sandis and Minister, for hosting me here and also giving me my first opportunity, amazingly, to see Riga. I now wonder why I didn't come before. I spent yesterday with the sun shining, walking around the beautiful old city, and was enchanted, and indeed. And I'm equally absorbed by the Riga conference, which I have the pleasure to attend. It's a particular pleasure for me to give a talk in the name of Isaiah Berlin, because he is genuinely one of my intellectual heroes. As you know, he spent his first 6 years of his life here in Riga, moved to St. Petersburg, and then his family, of course, fled the Russian Revolution shortly afterwards. I think 1919, he moved to Britain. And in Britain, he made his name very, very quickly as a scholar at Oxford, as a luminary, as a unique, really, particularly within the English tradition, as a unique 20th century philosopher who, in spite of being a Russianist, Latvian born and partly raised, and very much somebody steeped in the history of the German Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment and all the complexities that brought into the 20th century, that he was really the 20th century equivalent of John Stuart Mill. He was therefore in the tradition also of English liberal philosophers. And so myself, many, many decades later, studying at Oxford, studied a lot of Isaiah Berlin, read a lot of Isaiah, we were assigned a lot of Isaiah Berlin, two concepts of liberty, as Minister Braze just mentioned, the hedgehog and the fox, which I see. There's a Latvian translation just outside the door, essays on Russian novelists and so forth. And the life of Isaiah Berlin is not unrelated to the talk I'm going to give you now, which is about Brzezinski and the revenge of geopolitics, because both Brzezinski, who was of course Polish born and raised for his first few years, both Brzezinski and Berlin escaped a Russian-Soviet tyranny of their time. God is in the system here, definitely. By the way, I'm just going to take a tiny bit of water, in which I suspect there might have been some gin put in there, so if I start to slur, that is why. Both took with them as children to the West. Berlin to England when he was about 12, and Brzezinski across the Atlantic aged 10 in 1938, a few days after the notorious Munich Agreement between Hitler and Chamberlain, arriving in Montreal. Both of them, in their very early years, arrived with a burning sense of why they were leaving, of why they were in exile, of what it was that had threatened their world. And in Brzezinski's case, it led pretty much instantly, a year after he arrived in the New World, to the destruction of the world he knew, the streets of Warsaw. But Berlin is also relevant to this talk in the sense that his philosophy, which was neatly summarized by your wolves, sheep quote, but essentially that if you believe you have found the ultimate answer to the human question, that you have the idea of a perfect society, whether this be a religious perspective or an ideological, a secular ideological perspective. If you believe that it's only the efforts of men that could prevent us from reaching the gates of paradise, then any justification, any sacrifice, any bloodshed is justified in pursuit of that paradise. And it was in reaction to that, to all forms of totalitarianism, religious and secular, that Berlin, but also Brzezinski, really formed his worldview. And they had very different careers, but that is a very important common point. Let me just start by giving you a little brief overview of Brzezinski's life, and then I'll sort of move on to the grander strategic overlap between his role as a figure as a grand strategist during the Cold War and afterwards, his rivalry with Henry Kissinger, and what that how that can be applied to the, what I call revenge of geopolitics that we are living through, and particularly people in countries on the Russian border are living through in today's age. Winston Churchill once said that the further back you look, the further forward you can see, and I think that that is true. And in agreeing to do this biography, during COVID, in fact, 5 years ago, I thought this is going to be a real distraction, researching the life of somebody who was born in Warsaw in 1928 and who died in May 2017, the first few months of Trump's first administration. I thought this will be a wonderful distraction. And it was, but it wasn't a distraction. It was definitely wonderful intellectually, but it wasn't a distraction because the relevance of the challenges that Brzezinski and other Cold War figures faced during the 60s, 70s, 80s provided analogies, insights, historical sort of material for my day job, which is, as Sandis mentioned, as the Financial Times chief commentator in Washington, is grappling with the very, very real multipolar challenges that we're facing in today's world, in Trump's second administration. And I will get back onto that. But let me just start very briefly with Brzezinski's life. He was born, as I say, in 1928, which is the midpoint, really, of that very brief Polish Second Republic. 9 years after it had been created in the Treaty of Versailles, Woodrow Wilson's 13th point was the independence of a new Polish republic. And 11 years before, that republic was extinguished following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and then the dividing of Poland. And he only spent, although for his whole life, he kept his name against advice from newly fellow Americans. He kept his name, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he kept his accent right until he died. In spite of that, he was very much an American, very much an American thinker as well. So they moved to Canada in 1938. His father, Tadeusz Brzezinski, was a Polish diplomat, and I think no Pole with any education in 1938 was unaware of the benefit of moving to the New World. And as I say, this was a few days after Munich. And I pay quite a lot of attention, as any biographer should, to the early years, because the early years are formative in the making of the character. And Brzezinski's early years, he arrived without speaking a word of English in Montreal. And within a year, he was very, very academically gifted. Within a year, he won the first prize in English literature, the first prize in English poetry. So he just immediately absorbed. He was in an Anglophone school in Montreal. And a year after he arrived, of course, you get the German invasion of Poland. And then a few days after that, the pincer movement from the east, the Soviet invasion of Poland and occupation of the Baltics. And his diaries, which I fortunately had and got translated, he was still keeping them in Polish. And he's only 11, 12. His diaries record those first few days of blitzkrieg, the first real taste our species had of total war was on Warsaw. And he and his father would listen to Radio Warsaw at night, and they would listen to the accounts of the absolute destruction of the streets he knew when he was growing up. And it was an incredibly searing, formative experience for him. And after a couple of weeks, Radio Warsaw went silent, except for every night towards midnight, it would play the first 11 notes of a Polonaise by Chopin, by the composer Chopin. And then one night in early October, a few weeks after the invasion, those first 11 notes of Chopin were replaced by Deutschland über alles. And he writes in his diary that the sound of the German national anthem replacing Chopin was as big a sort of guillotine on his world as any news of the killing and the destruction, that change of sound. And these diaries are an account of the war. Remember, this is a pre-teen boy and then an early teen boy, and it's incredibly detailed daily accounts of movements in the war, of battles, of people being fired, or what Roosevelt said to Congress, whatever it might be. Occasionally, as he gets older, there's a mention of a girl. Then there are lots of mentions of girls, but it's like one sentence. I dated Anne Smith, and then General Anders advanced up the Italian peninsula, and blah, blah, blah. So you could see this mind is very, very precocious and obsessive. And I emphasize Canada as well, because at the end of his time in Canada, he was at McGill University in Montreal. He did something which is very unusual for a biographer in the life of any significant person, which is he provided, aged 22, in his master's thesis, he provided the outline, the sort of microcosm of the strategy he would pursue for the rest of his life. And this is extremely unusual, that young, aged 22, to lay it all out so clearly. A strategy that in 1950 was a supreme sort of statement of arrogance, which is, you have all got it wrong, the Cold War. You Sovietologists at Harvard, you Sovietologists at Columbia, you have got it wrong. And it was still present in 1989 when the Cold War ended and the Iron Curtain came down. And the thesis was this. It was entitled Russo-Soviet Nationalism, 150 pages or so, in which he says, look, we have George Kennan, we have containment, the first sort of Cold War strategy that America produced. And containment's all very well, but it seeks simply to contain, to stop the Soviet Empire, to stop the Eastern Bloc from moving westwards. But containment has, and Sovietology, has nothing to say about what's happening behind that Iron Curtain, inside of the bloc. And he said that there was something that people had missed, which was the Soviet Union's, what he called Achilles heel of the Soviet Union. And that Achilles heel was the nations, the nationalities, not just the captive nations, as they were called in Washington in those days, not just Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, etc., but also the nations within the USSR, the Soviet republics, the Baltics, Ukraine, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, etc. And that these people did not speak Soviet. There was no language called Soviet. These people spoke their own languages, and to get ahead, they had to learn Russian. And the resentment of these nations, some of whom believed that they were really colonies, should be harnessed, weaponized, stoked, encouraged, in order to not just contain the Soviet Union, but to use these seeds to bring about the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This is in 1950, and he's 22. And it's a real sort of middle finger to dominant Sovietology at that time. Brzezinski had learned Russian, and of course he spoke Polish, so he had a different sensibility. He had a different perspective to most Sovietologists, many of whom didn't speak Russian. And he took this to Harvard in 1950 after finishing, quickly rose at Harvard, got beaten to a tenured professorship, and so not by Henry Kissinger. The legend is it was Kissinger, it wasn't, it was somebody else. But he then went to Columbia in New York, and he set up with a lot of private philanthropic money, he set up something called the study of comparative communism. It was a research center into communism, but it was a study of comparative communism. And this was new in the American scene. It was based on the idea that conventional wisdom saw the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc as a whole. It saw it as a monolith, as a one system. And he said, no, we have to study the tensions within it. And so he launched the study of comparative communism and quickly got into trying to promote his ideas in Washington, first of all with the Kennedy administration, and then he served inside the Johnson administration in a pretty junior role. But he kept pushing this idea of peaceful engagement with Eastern Europe, of peaceful engagement. So the idea was that you increase people-to-people contacts with the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, etc., sports, business, commerce, loans, that you relax them about ties with the West, but you at the same time have to relax Moscow. Moscow has to feel relaxed enough to permit this loosening. So there was a paradox in this peaceful Eastern engagement. And he carried this through as an academic, and then as he managed through trickery, really, to get Lyndon Johnson to give a speech endorsing peaceful engagement and saying that Europe should recognize the post-war borders, which West Germany was not happy about. Of course, a large chunk of West Germany had gone into Poland via East Germany. And Brzezinski said, no, whilst this German sword is hanging over, not just Poland, but Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, whilst there are lots of Germans who are from German-speaking areas in Poland and Czechoslovakia wanting to go home, the Eastern Bloc will never relax. So we have to recognize these borders. And Johnson gave this speech. I don't think he knew what kind of speech he was giving. He just wanted to talk about something other than Vietnam. Vietnam was dominating him. Brzezinski says, I've got an idea. And he manages to get this speech. And the speech led to the collapse of Ludwig Erhard government in West Germany. So this was a very entrepreneurial, young Polish-American academic. Then, as Sanders mentioned, he becomes Jimmy Carter's national security advisor in 1977 at a peak geopolitical moment, really in a peak geopolitical decade. The relaxation of ties between America and the Soviet Union, détente, something pioneered by Henry Kissinger. This relaxation, détente was basically declining. The Soviets were pushing in the Horn of Africa, in Central America, in Angola. There was a ferment in Afghanistan. And Carter comes in, a president who's now, I think, unfairly downplayed, because he was in the middle of the sandwich of Nixon and then Reagan. And Carter comes in and is the first president in many presidencies to take the ideological offensive to the Soviet Union. He had no Vietnam albatross around his neck. Vietnam was over, the Americans had left. It was an embarrassing end to the American presence in Vietnam, but Carter inherited a blank sheet, no more apologies. And he took the ideological offensive back to the Soviet Union after many, many years where America had been on the defensive. And his weapon, his tool, was human rights. His tool was human rights, and his tool was peaceful engagement with the satellite countries of Eastern Europe. And his first state visit as president was to Poland. Perhaps uncoincidentally, Brzezinski managed to persuade Carter to go to Poland. And you have in his hands something that was negotiated by the brief presidency that preceded Carter, Gerald Ford, the Helsinki Final Act. And the Helsinki Final Act, something Brzezinski had been pushing for, says that all borders, post-war borders, must be recognized. So that satisfied Soviet conditions, but as a price for that, you have to sign up to all these things that don't really matter, don't pay attention to them, like human rights, like freedom of expression, like freedom of religion. Don't worry, it's just small print. And that's how it was treated for a couple of years. Carter, at Brzezinski's instigation, picked up this small print and weaponized it. And you have, of course, not just these Helsinki watch groups that are happening. You have the Jewish refuseniks, Andrei Sakharov. You have Amnesty International winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Nobel are very, they time their prizes. We might be about to find out how well they time their prizes. But this was used, and it helped stoke samizdat. It helped stoke the sort of civic resistance and dissident groups behind the Iron Curtain, and really sort of changed the nature of the Cold War. It got more tense as a result. Now, who was Brzezinski fighting with? Well, Kissinger. Kissinger was, and this is a very, very key relationship, relevant to today, a very key rivalry between these two grand strategists, between Brzezinski and Kissinger, and a fascinating sort of frenemyship. They were addicted to each other, to arguing with each other. They had dinner a lot, but they were ideological, or at least strategic, opponents. And the difference between them is really quite important. And here the hedgehog and the fox, I think it becomes very relevant. Kissinger was a pessimist. He believed that the Soviet Union was catching up with the United States. This had been the view after Sputnik in 1957, that they were catching up. And Kissinger believed that it was a matter of time before the Soviets emulated America's economic and technological power, not just nuclear weapons, but economic and technological. And therefore his role, the role of a good statesman, should be to have stability and understanding between these two great powers. And that's what he pursued with détente, with the nuclear arms limitation, SALT I. And of course, in that sort of grand, great power formula, modeled on 1815 Congress of Vienna, which ended the Napoleonic Wars. But in that Kissinger sort of formula, there was no real voice for small countries. There was no real role for the Achilles heel. In fact, quite the opposite. They were kind of a nuisance. And the agreement was, we each have a sphere of interest. The Soviets have their sphere, their bloc, and we have ours. And we don't want to antagonize. And so he cut things like Radio Free Europe. Brzezinski, of course, as I've outlined, since he was 22, had a very, very different view, which was that not only was the Soviet Union inherently fragile, because people felt that they were part of a Russian empire, dressed in Marxist, in Bolshevik clothing, but nevertheless an empire. But he also was an optimist. He believed that the Soviet Union was falling way behind economically and technologically. And he used to visit the Soviet Union at every opportunity in the 60s and the 70s till he got into the White House. And he would test these theories against what he saw. And what he saw, and those of you who were old enough, the Latvians here who were old enough, will recognize this, what he saw was a kind of grey, kind of dull, very non-entrepreneurial, very sort of lifeless economic and social situation on the streets of Soviet cities, people who he argued with, conversed with. And he developed this phrase, he used this phrase that promotion in the Soviet system is on the basis of reverse natural selection, meaning that the less innovative you were, the fewer ideas you had, the faster you got promoted. And although he wasn't an economist, he was very clear that America was leaving the Soviet Union in the dust, technologically and economically. The only area in which the Soviets were overtaking was nuclear technology, which they were. And so to sort of leap ahead a little bit to the end of the Cold War, Carter, of course, is defeated. Carter leaves in place for Reagan to inherit dramatic nuclear modernization, and all kinds of things like the funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which were controversial, but which were bleeding Soviet military capability, and other things that we know now as Reaganism were actually put in place the last 2 years of the Carter regime. And as I say in this book, Reagan offered Brzezinski to be his own national security advisor twice. And Brzezinski said, when one of Reagan's people, George Shultz, said, you have to join us, Brzezinski said, no, they, meaning the Democrats, they need me more. And so he didn't. But fast forward to 1989, we think of the Cold War as ending when the Berlin Wall fell on November the 9th, 1989. But it actually fell on June the 4th, 1989, which is a notorious date because that's first of all remembered for the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. But it's remembered more in this part of the world, and particularly in Poland, as the date that Solidarity swept the elections in Poland. And so strong was their landslide, the Solidarity Lech Walensa's landslide, that General Jaruzelski, the Polish leader, with Gorbachev's permission in Moscow, agreed, okay, you can form a government. That was the day that the Cold War ended. The day when the Soviets said, we have given up our monopoly on political power. And Brzezinski had, with Pope John Paul II, a Pole, who he knew from before he became Pope, had sort of been a mentor to the Polish Solidarity movement, which was really the most potent expression of what he wrote about in 1950. And so when we get to comparisons between Kissinger and Brzezinski, I do think of that little booklet outside the door, the Isaiah Berlin essay on the hedgehog and the fox. Now, of course, Berlin was writing about Tolstoy and Turgenev, and he was writing about Russian literature. But it's commonly applied, his hedgehog and his fox analogy, to Winston Churchill and Winston Churchill's critics. Certainly in Britain, that was how Isaiah Berlin's lesson was often taken, because Churchill was like the hedgehog. He got one big thing right, but he got all the small things wrong. He got First World War military tactics wrong. He got Ireland wrong. He got India wrong. He got the gold standard wrong. And the foxes, for the most part, got these things right. The fox being a creature that knows lots of things, that is cunning, flexible, versatile, wily. And the hedgehog, of course, knows one thing, how to protect itself. But Churchill did get the one big issue of his time right, which was the transcendence of the Nazi fascist threat. And most of the foxes did not. They were behind Chamberlain in the Munich Agreement. And I think when it comes to the Cold War, Brzezinski's the hedgehog. And Kissinger, who was a much, much more broad-ranging diplomatic figure and an incredibly skilled, deeply controversial wunderkind, he was the fox. But there is no doubt that in terms of diagnosing the Soviet Union's Achilles heel and not just forecasting how the Soviet Union would unravel, but putting in place measures, strategic and tactical measures that would help accelerate the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Brzezinski was proved right on that one big issue. He was wrong on so much, by the way. We won't talk about Iran or the Iranian hostage crisis. But on the biggest issue of his time, he was right and Kissinger was wrong. And I emphasize that because, and I also emphasize that Kissinger had been a pessimist and Brzezinski had been the optimist, because that changes the moment the Cold War ends. Brzezinski became a pessimist really very, very quickly. Now we have this wonderfully liberating moment for people from the Baltics, people from Eastern Europe, and people within Russia. We have the creation of, or recreation of these new nations, the rebirth. We have the first sort of semi-oligarchic democracy that Russia's really ever experienced under Boris Yeltsin. And so it was an amazing time, the early 90s. And by the way, when I was a student in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and we heard about the opening of Checkpoint Charlie, and we got into a train, took a ferry from England to Belgium, rented a car, drove from Zeebrugge to Berlin at like 120 miles an hour, because there are no speed limits in Germany. And we got there and we got a pickaxe, like everybody else, tens of thousands of people, and we just attacked the Berlin Wall. So I sort of feel something of that spirit, nothing like the same intensity that you felt, those of you old enough, in 1989, 1990, when your new nations were born. And in Washington, there was an extraordinary feeling, understandably, of triumph, that the second great ideological threat of the 20th century, first Nazism, now communism, had been defeated, and this time peacefully, mostly peacefully, without too many shots being fired. The ideological battle had been won, and so a real sense of triumphalism in the early 1990s. Of course, the famous book, The End of History, by Francis Fukuyama, a much more sophisticated book than it's caricatured as being, but essentially he said all ideological argument is over, and some variation of liberal democracy is the end state of humanity. And in the midst of this triumphalism, Brzezinski wrote this book, much less well read, much smaller sales, called Out of Control, in which he warns of a sole superpower, a unipolar world, a hyperpower, that is drunk on its own pride, on its own hubris, that has forgotten strategy, that has forgotten that there is a world out there in which there are still powers with militaries and different feelings, and that those who perceived themselves to be on the losing side of the Cold War would gradually coalesce with each other and form what he called the axis of the aggrieved. And this axis included China this time as the big brother, Russia as the little brother, Iran, North Korea, and others. And if you read this book now, this book is Out of Control from 1993. It reads, of course, as a pessimistic book at the time. Now it reads simply as a description of today. And if you look back at May, at the Victory in Europe May parade in Red Square in Moscow, he had Xi Jinping with him. I can't remember when Narendra Modi turned up. He certainly had one of the senior ayatollahs. If you look at the gathering of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that Xi Jinping hosted in late August in Tianjin, they're all there. There is an axis of the aggrieved. It's not coherent. It doesn't have a new world order, but it is very much on the other side of the divide. It's something that Brzezinski was not popular in pointing out in 1993 would happen. So we have this decade of what at the time, well, at the end of which was dubbed the holiday from history, the 1990s, a vacation from history, in which democracy spread all around the world, in this part of the world, but in every continent, not just in the former Soviet bloc, but in Africa, in Latin America, in Central Asia, and elsewhere. And so the story was unfolding in a Fukuyama direction. And then 9/11 happens. And 9/11, of course, is the return of history. And it's the beginning of the revenge of geopolitics. Now, I don't really want to go into too much detail about what's happened since then, because I think in the question and answers we'll get into today's geopolitical dilemmas and quandaries. But since 9/11, we have had what the Stanford political scientist, who I strongly recommend you read, Larry Diamond, what Larry Diamond's called the democratic recession. And the democratic recession is not just that there are fewer democracies around the world. There is, I think, latest count, 24 fewer today than there were in the year 2001. But it's also that countries that were not democracies have become even more undemocratic. Russia, of course, is a very good example. You could see the imperfect, messy, very corrupt, oligarchic outlines of some kind of freedom in Yeltsin's Russia. Under Putin, obviously, it very, very quickly starts moving, well, very, very steadily starts moving in an autocratic direction. China, too, in the year 2001, under Jiang Zemin, was more of an authoritarian country, less of a totalitarian country. That too has moved back into more totalitarian territory under Xi Jinping. And so we have not just the return of geopolitics, but the resumption of ideological arguments between democracy and other forms of government, notably autocracies. And so Brzezinski got very frustrated in the early 2000s with America's response to the return of history, to the revenge of geopolitics. He saw the global war on terror, the way that the Bush administration was conducting, as being basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for autocracies like Russia and China, that they could brand anybody they like as a terrorist and America would applaud or turn a blind eye. And that this was really a very important boost to Putin's power, was his skillful use of the global war on terror environment and some of the things America was doing to crack down on dissent, not just in Chechnya, but elsewhere, and to consolidate his grip on power. Ditto with China. It's common to sort of think of the last 20 years as being one windfall after another for China. One big geopolitical windfall after another. The first being America's response to 9/11, its overreaction, which Brzezinski was a very, very prominent critic of. And, of course, the invasion of Iraq, ditto. The second being the global financial recession of 2008, which was really an Atlantic recession, not a global one, because India, China, and others kept growing. And the third being a sort of ultimate shock to the Western democratic world's own self-image, was the first election of Donald Trump in 2016, which happened a few months after, for me, parochially, the equally big shock of Brexit. And Brzezinski kept saying, and here he and Kissinger agreed with each other, look, geopolitics is normal. Geopolitics is the state of human history. Just as Isaiah Berlin was right in saying there is no perfect society and anybody who's aiming for it is dangerous, that's the basis of liberal democracy. The basis of liberal democracy is pessimism about human nature. There is no such thing as the ultimate answer. We must build a system that contains the ability of those who think there is an ultimate answer to impose it on us. Well, the same applied to geopolitics. There's no end of great power conflict because we are humans, as Berlin pointed out, but as the pessimistic Kissinger and the newly pessimistic Brzezinski understood. Human folly never ends. I interviewed Kissinger quite a lot for this biography. So Brzezinski died in May 2017, and Kissinger died aged 100 in November 2023. And he was very generous with his time, and very interested in this biography of his great rival. I asked him where he thought Brzezinski would rank in terms of America's 20th century Cold War grand strategists, and he said he was definitely in the top 2. So I was just scratching my head, who could possibly be number 1? But then I said, so what is it that you had in common? And he really, wanted to emphasize and became quite poetic in saying, look, we both came from pretty tragic early 20th century bloodlands of Central and Eastern Europe. And we came as immigrants, extraordinary, welcoming United States. That in the early Cold War, you have an amazing federal government partnership with the universities, with Ivy League, and a thirst for knowledge, a thirst for Soviet area studies, but not just the sort of Russianists, but scientists, sociologists, and so on. And this system was meritocratic, it welcomed us. And we each rose to the highest possible level you could rise as a naturalized American, as a foreign-born American. He said, but we both also brought with us an understanding of the fragility of society, of the thinness of civilization. And here, this is very Berlin-esque. And that there is no ultimate victory. History doesn't stop, it goes on and on and on. There's no end point, there's no formula that ends history. And and here I'm paraphrasing Kissinger, said, well, whilst there are definitely Americans and American-born Americans who grasp this, George Kennan was one, in a different way, Dean Acheson, Harry Truman's Secretary of State, was another, the whole present, the creation, which was the name of his memoirs, they were also quite flinty, quite realistic. But he said, this is something that we both, for all our disagreements, me being Kissinger and Brzezinski, this is something we shared, which is an understanding that the game is never over. And America in the 90s, and in a very different way in the 21st century, has behaved very differently to how it conducted itself during the Cold War. We are now living in a sort of revenge of geopolitics. Trump 2.0 is very different to Trump 1.0. I've been in Washington since 2006, so I've seen the build-up. I don't think Trump is the cause of this. I think he's a product of the rapidly changing world. And I think that having studied Brzezinski's life and more generally the Cold War, we're in a situation that is a lot more complex and a lot more volatile than the Cold War. The Cold War was bipolar, 2 poles, Moscow and Washington. And so you can at least, in terms of physics, understand how you get some kind of stability, equilibrium, when there's 2 poles. When there's many poles, the need for strategic thinking, the need to live and breathe the languages of your adversaries, to understand how they think, what they want, is even greater. That is strategic thinking. Essentially, it's understanding what your adversary wants, the better to prevent conflict, to reach non-lethal outcomes that suit you and with which they can live. And what instead you see is sort of the mirror image of the early Cold War. We had federal government war on the universities, a federal government stop sign to immigrants. And we have something, whilst it's not present at the destruction, I think that's too strong, but we have a president who doesn't really believe in the world America created. And so we have something but somewhere in between, present at the reinvention and present at the destruction. And I don't know exactly where it's going to land, but I've deliberately sort of left that sort of current affairs portion of this evening to the question and answers. And I haven't even looked at the time, and I don't know how long there is for that. But yeah, sorry, I've spoken for a bit longer than, no, about right. I spoke for about 45 minutes, right? So I've left about half an hour for any questions you might have, and for me to test whether this really is water or gin and tonic. I think it's got gin in it. Anyway, thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, sir, for the lecture. I have two questions, if possible. One, picking up on the very last talk you had, destruction versus reinvention, Donald Trump. The question being, so in your view, does Donald Trump or MAGA have a grand strategy as such, or is everything more improvised, ad hoc, reactive? And the second question, you studied Brzezinski, Kissinger, other grand strategists. What are the personal or character traits that make one a great grand strategist? Thank you.
That's a great question, or two questions. The first is there a MAGA grand strategy? Does Trump have a grand strategy? The answer is no. He has instincts, but he doesn't really have a foreign policy. And to illustration of that observation, ask Indians. Now, India has been used for 30 years now to a relationship with the United States, where the United States says, we want you to succeed. The more you grow, the better you do, the more you will counterbalance China. And there's no one else of the size possible than India that could counterbalance China in the region. And in the last few months, I used to be based in India for the Financial Times, and in the last few months, so I hear from a lot of Indians, Trump has signaled he really doesn't care about the geopolitical consequences. It's not the downstream effects of not only sort of declaring, a trade war with India, which today I believe there is some kind of settlement to for the time being, but of inviting the head of the Pakistan military to lunch, one-to-one, which you don't do as a president. I mean, if the head of the military has had a coup, then you have him to lunch. But when he's just head of military, you don't have him to lunch. And pulling India's chain. And the Indians say, why is he doing this? Is he moving into the Pakistan-China orbit? No, it's just a way of getting a better deal. And that's why he doesn't worry about the downstream effects of the Japan deal, which is really humiliating. Japan not only has, 15% tariffs, but it's pledged to spend hundreds of billions of dollars investing in the United States, in which up to 90% of the returns from those investments goes to the United States. This is like rubbing your foot in. Again, when people say to him, but they're an ally, they're a neighbor of China, like South Korea, which has had a very humiliating, doesn't really move Trump. Trump wants the best commercial deals, the art of the deal. So, crudely speaking, if you were going to sort of give him a foreign policy philosophy, it would be spheres of interest. It would be, it's unfair to Kissinger to say this is Kissingerian because it's a different, but it's that China has its neighborhood, its backyard. India is in your backyard. Russia has its neighborhood, its backyard. You're in Russia's backyard. And we've got, we can do what we like with Panama, even Canada. Greenland is in our hemisphere. And Venezuela, of course, is getting a very tense situation there. This is more the sort of, it's not really a philosophy. And one of the amusing things in the last few months is watching foreign policy experts try to dress up what Trump does as a school of foreign policy, which people call sane washing. I don't believe that there is a coherent foreign policy philosophy there beyond the sort of law of the jungle. And the law of the jungle is America is the biggest predator, but China is a big predator too. Russia is a big predator, and he respects other predators. Everyone else, to one degree or another, is prey. They're antelopes. And I wouldn't sort of dress it up any more than that. There are people within MAGA who do have foreign policy philosophies. J.D. Vance has a much more coherent neo-isolationist philosophy. Elbridge Colby in the Pentagon, he has a prioritizer philosophy which believes Europe should deal with Russia and Ukraine and we should deal with China in Taiwan. But Trump isn't any of these schools. Trump is just Trump. And all the people working for him, they don't know what the policy will be tomorrow. And I include Rubio, I include Vance, I include what characteristics do strategists share? I mean, I couldn't think of two more different personalities than Kissinger and Brzezinski. I mean, or George Kennan, or go back to the beginning to Sun Tzu and von Clausewitz. You're talking about very different people. But I think the point I mentioned, which is an intellectual understanding that the more knowledge you have of everything, because strategy is, everything is relevant. There's an amazing passage in one of Brzezinski's diaries about watching a football game in Georgia, in which first in Tbilisi, in which first of all there was the Soviet national anthem, and people didn't stand up. This is late 1950s. Then there was the Georgian anthem, and everybody stood up and cheered. That everything is relevant. All knowledge is relevant to a strategic brain. But personality traits, as wide as human variation.
Well, thank you. This was a fascinating lecture. A truly joy to listen to you. You mentioned 75, Helsinki Final Act, and of course, 75 is Ford administration, right? It's Kissinger who is the architect of the Helsinki Final Act. Mm-hmm. You say this is initially the idea of Zbigniew Brzezinski. So what kind of interaction is there if Kissinger is the one who's getting this strategy to the finish line? And I spent some time interacting with Latvian community in the United States, and 75 is not a joyful time for Latvian community or the Baltic community. This is a lot of distrust in Ford administration, although Ford being very positive towards Baltic communities, but the Kissinger personality was creating a lot of suspicion in Baltic communities, particularly this deal in Helsinki Final Act, whereas we recognize the current borders, which was interpreted as recognition of the occupation.
Yep.
We eternally recognize the current borders. So I wonder if you could speak about this interaction, and since I have a microphone, I'm sorry. Another question.
Just one.
Just another one. Yeah, 21, 22.
Mm-hmm.
Allies trying to build a deterrence, trying to deter war. Do you have, having studied Brzezinski's and Kissinger, do you have any reference point in history where similar situation or something helpful? That's something that U.S. has done already previously that has worked. So why I'm asking is, Zbignew's son, Ian, in 2021, he wrote an article based on his father's work in the administration, I believe it was 81, where Zbigniew Brzezinski believed that an imminent, 56, 78 moment is coming, this time to Poland. Solidarność moving, rising up, and Russians moving divisions to the eastern border, to the Polish border. At that time, Zbigniew was the one who crafted a deterrent strategy, and so Ian truly believes that this is what worked. Zbigniew's his father's work, his father's grand strategy deterred Soviets from moving into Poland. I don't know if you share that view, but also can you reflect, that period and compare it to 21? Why we were not able to deter? Did we even try to deter? And I work in security policy. I truly believe in deterrence, and I don't think we actually created a deterrence in 21.
Those are two very good questions. Let me deal with the second first and then get to the Helsinki. The Soviet non-invasion of Poland in 1980 was a significant event that didn't happen. It would have been orders of magnitude more provocative and incendiary than the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia or 56 Hungary, both of which Brzezinski had studied, and he'd realized that the Dulles State Department, Eisenhower administration, and then LBJ in 1968 have both said, we don't really care, it's in your sphere of interest. So 1980, you have this pure chance, this luck of the fact that there is a Polish-speaking Pope in the Vatican and a Polish-speaking National Security Advisor in the White House who talk so much that Brzezinski has P for Pope on his White House phone. So he has a Vatican hotline. He just presses P and the Pope picks up, which is a great thing to have. He and the Pope tried successfully by restraining Lech Walesa. And remember, the Gdansk shipyard, what is it that's all over the shipyard? It's not just the Solidarity flag, it's pictures of the Pope. And I think the Soviets were really confused by this. This is a workers' movement. We don't need a workers' movement. We are the workers' society, but it's got a religious figure as its symbol. And so Brzezinski and the Pope used this to say, look, Poland's very different to Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Those were students and intellectuals. This is the workers, the church, of course the intellectuals and the students, but also sections of the Polish army. You will find that Poland is indigestible. They restrained Walesa to give less provocation. But they also, he persuaded Carter to issue very, very strong, very much stronger language, the opposite of Johnson in 68 and Eisenhower in 56, saying there will be serious consequences to this. And remember, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan a year earlier, and they were dealing with this uprising, this increasingly bloody, costly uprising. 75, this was the West Europeans who insisted on Basket 3. Basket 3 of the Helsinki Final Act, the human rights one, but Brzezinski was really urging them. Kissinger had no interest and tried to prevent it from happening. He thought it would provoke the Soviets. And then if you see the minutes of his meetings with the Soviets at that time, and indeed with Brezhnev, he says, no, don't worry, it's just a form of words. Nothing's going to happen. Your system will remain the same, and ours will remain the same. And that's how it was, except there were people in Eastern Europe who took it literally. And then they got an administration in Washington that took it literally. And it should, just as a sort of final footnote to my answer, the debate between Ford and Carter, the second presidential debate in San Francisco in October 1976, they were neck and neck, Ford and Carter. There was nothing between them. What broke Ford was Carter pushing him into making a mistake by saying the Poles are independent, they don't feel dominated. The Hungarians are independent, the Romanians are independent, they don't feel dominated. And Ford actually said this, and at that moment he lost what they called the ethnic vote in the swing states of Ohio and elsewhere. And this was like Brzezinski prepping. And it was messing with Ford's head because Ford was being attacked from the right, very much in line with how people felt here, which is you've sold us out. You recognize Soviet occupation. So Reagan called Helsinki the new Yalta. So Ford's being attacked from the right, But he's being attacked from the left by Carter for saying there's a human rights basket and you're doing nothing. You don't care. You refuse to meet Solzhenitsyn because it would be a provocation. So Ford's head is so messed up and he just walks into this trap, and that's what lost him the election. George Gallup, the famous pollster, said that debate lost him the election. And that was really, really about the ethnic, including Latvian, votes in places like Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago.
I'd like to ask you, what is your opinion of Trump's attitude to NATO? And do you think Article 5 would be called into action if there is aggression, let's say just in one Baltic country, not in a big country but in a small country, say Latvia, Lithuania or Estonia? What would happen then, in your view, in terms of what is inside Trump's head at the moment? I know it's a very difficult question because it changes by the second.
It's an incredibly live and important question, not just here in this part of the world. That is impossible to say because Trump is unpredictable. Remember what he said. He was out of office, but remember what he said when, in February 24th, when Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022. He said it was a brilliant move. Something, I forget the exact form of words, something like this is a genius move. Because he believed, along with everybody else, that it would take a few days. And he's sort of repeatedly gone back to that sort of admiration for Putin's prowess. And he's always seen NATO as with some reason, like his predecessors, like Obama did, like Bush Jr. did, like even Clinton did. He's always seen NATO as being one big power that pays, if not most of the bills, that pays the big bills. And everyone else is getting a free lunch. And it's a caricature, but there is some truth to it. He doesn't like NATO, but this 5% agreement at the Hague NATO summit, and the fact that Putin is now going out of his way to humiliate Trump suggests to me that his reaction would be much less predictable than if you had asked me the same question 6 months ago. That said, Trump only likes fights he can win. This is why he is, when he gave the UN speech 2 weeks ago, attacking everybody, particularly allies, like Vance did in Munich in February, on Valentine's Day, of all days, that speech that Trump gave at the UN, "You're all going to hell," he said. London is run by Sharia Islamic law. My daughter's at university there, and she would disagree. He didn't mention China once. Nothing critical about China. On that day, he was also critical about Putin. I mean, he's clearly he's feeling humiliated. China, nothing, no bad words. So he doesn't like to pick fights he's not going to win. And I don't know whether he'd want to pick a fight with, he might admire, who knows, he could admire Putin moving into Estonia or engineering some kind of a false flag operation to justify green men, whatever the scenario. He could admire it, he could do nothing, say it's a Europe problem, or he could respond kinetically. It's so difficult to predict. Trump is unpredictable, and by design, that's how he did property deals. He likes to be unpredictable. It's a deliberate part of his style.
So Article 5 doesn't matter, right?
The most live Article 5 discussions, other than what Putin would do, is what would we do if, Trump decided he wants a Canadian province or Greenland? Are we showing enough solidarity with Denmark? Are we showing enough solidarity with Canada? I think, when it comes to showing the kind of resolve, spine, and principles that we say NATO embodies, both the negative and positive liberty, that also implies, that we have solidarity with other small or medium-sized members of NATO when you get this surreal Alice in Wonderland talk from the President of the United States.
Thank you. So I saw another, yes.
Yes, thank you for your speech. And I took your remarks actually as portraying Brzezinski as being quite Fox-like. He was quite prescient on many matters, and from your book I understand that he also avidly encouraged Clinton to move much more forcefully on the Middle East, especially the question of Palestinian statehood. And my question is, considering this past week's developments, from a Brzezinski perspective, how would you view the perspective on the Palestinian situation, considering that not much is mentioned in the agreement on a Palestinian state in the West Bank? And just a brief rejoinder, the Helsinki Agreement also did provide in Article 1 for peaceful change of borders.
Right. No, that's fair. That's a fair point. Look, I mean, I think he would be in favor of any US president who faced down a leader such as Netanyahu and attempted to use America's leverage, because it's really the only country with leverage, in order to force some kind of a process that might end in a settlement. As you, I think, sort of alluded to, the Carter administration was the first that secured in the famous Camp David talks. 13 days they were locked up in Camp David. No cell phones, no internet. It was radio silence. Carter, Menachem Begin, Anwar Sadat. And that produced the first ever recognition of Israel by an Arab country, Egypt. So not a trivial Arab country, the biggest Arab military power. And it did also, part 2 of Camp David, provide for not a two-state solution, but a path to a Palestinian homeland. The second part was pretty quickly walked away from by Carter. But I have no doubt that, were Brzezinski alive today, that he would be biting his lip and congratulating Trump for standing up to, at least in the last few days, for standing up to Netanyahu, because the path on which Netanyahu is going, maybe we're already way past that point, makes any kind of stable solution look like a pipe dream.
Thank you so much for the very interesting lecture. What you said today about the game never really being over and it continuing on and on and on really reminded me a couple of years ago when Timothy Snyder was here in Riga for a Berlin lecture as well. And maybe having lived through Brzezinski's biography while writing it so beautifully, might I add, is there a point in time in history that you would compare today to? And what are the implications of this, and maybe an analysis from a Brzezinski point of view as well, because we've heard different opinions, and I would love to hear yours as well. Thank you so much.
That's a great, really difficult question. So there are two periods that people are now, and have for some time been comparing today to. One is the pre-1914 period, with America as Britain and a rising Germany as China. And the other is the 1930s, which is, of course, the breakdown of confidence in liberal democratic systems, the rise of extreme right and extreme left, the challenge. Just look at the French opinion polls. You see the analogy there, and of course you see the analogy with what's at stake in terms of the global order in the US-China rivalry. History is really, really useful to just stimulate your imagination about what is possible. Of course, it's not a science, but we have no science for human behavior. We think we do, we pretend we do. The joke that economics has physics envy. Well, political science and international relations have economics envy. They, and history to some degree too, has been sort of colonized by the metric disease. But in a more sort of sense of analogy, the immersion in history, and hopefully our leaders' immersion in history, can can tutor them about where things have gone wrong before and what we can do to preempt them from going wrong. And so I don't think we're in pre-1914 necessarily, and I don't think we're in the 1930s necessarily, because of course each of them are analogies because of how they end, and we don't know how today ends. We are in possession of human agency. One of the things Isaiah Berlin said when this was a reaction to Marxism is history is more than just impersonal structural forces. History is also something that individuals can work and groups can work their will on. And I think we are, we have pretty much no excuse for not understanding those really big 20th century lessons for what we're facing today. So that's not a very uplifting answer, but I don't know how this ends. We could have a positive shock. I know I went to university with Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister. There was some. We saw the Moldova elections a week or two ago. Some positive things are happening. It's not all going in one direction.
Thank you so much. Well, the fact from Brzezinski's life that fascinates me the most is the one that you mentioned from 1950, that as a young man he wrote down his grand strategy for life, as far as I understood it. And I wonder if you could share a bit more about what it was. Was it a set of principles that he wrote down for himself? Or was it essentially a goal that he put down as a young emigre from Poland to see his Poland free one day, and then he worked towards this goal for the next 40 years? I think it's exciting that a 22-year-old guy could write something like this down. Thank you.
It's a really good question. I mean, it's a much more empirical than that. There's a section on Ukraine, there's a section on Georgia, there's a section on each of the internal USSR republics, and it shows how the purges and the population transfers and the effects of agricultural collectivization, the Holodomor, the famines, etc., didn't happen in Russia. They only happened in the republics. And that the party leadership in these republics increasingly became Russian. And for the and he shows it sort of statistically, with numbers, that the Russification of the Soviet Union. Then on the external bit, the sort of post-Second World War, the captive nations, there's, it's a very sort of case-by-case study of each of the nations, how they went communist, and what methods were being applied to Russify the satellite countries. But a very big emphasis, as you would expect, on Marshal Tito, on Yugoslavia. As an example, America needs to study how do you stimulate semi-detachment from Moscow. And of course, the answer with the Yugoslavia situation, is that they had their own revolution. It didn't come with Soviet tanks at the end of the Second World War. It's them who defeated the Germans and restricted the British. And so therefore they had their own revolution and felt much less, sort of, the communists there felt much less beholden than the Polish communists who came in with the Soviet tanks, the Lublin Committee. So it's quite it's quite empirical. And of course you can feel the principles, and you can feel his Polishness in the identity of the subject, but the actual material is dispassionate. It's an academic thesis that got him admitted to Harvard.
Luce, can you give me what should Europe do to influence the Soviet population to change, to improve to become a more democratic system?
Europe. So as a columnist for the FT, columnists the danger of being a columnist is you get more and more arrogant. You think you know the answer to every question. And I really don't have, so I'm aware of this. It hasn't stopped me from becoming more arrogant, but or hopefully less unarrogant, so put the emphasis the other side. But I really don't know the answer to that question. But I mean, I really hope some people do.
So you spent years of researching Brzezinski life and thoughts. So what did you discover some ideas that actually changed your own view and the way how you look on the processes in the world?
That's a very good question. I find history to be even turbulent, very geopolitical, nuclear shadow era, history to be very reassuring in the current context. It's like it keeps me saying we've been through extremely hazardous situations before, as they did in the late Cold War in particular, and in the early Cold War. So I learned sort of a meta lesson, which is the importance of not just studying other countries, but studying our past to try and better grapple with today. That's a sort of meta lesson. As in sort of particular stories, just everything was a revelation. I mean, I got a hold of this really extraordinary correspondence between Pope John Paul II and Brzezinski, and got it translated. It was in Polish. So that's, for the first time, really interesting correspondence. The joke was Andropov, who was head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, when Pope John Paul II was elected, said it was a Brzezinski plot. And he ordered out this KGB report. There's this big KGB report saying Brzezinski he rigged the conclave. He got pot. And then the White House, there was a joke. There was a joke that, well, the Italian and Spanish cardinals, the two big groups, were divided, so they took a poll. But I mean, each of these stories, the extraordinary relationship between Kissinger and Brzezinski, and the correspondence, again, it's just for me, it was all a revelation. I was utterly absorbed. It was a deeply immersive, absorbing project.
Great. So thank you, Edward, for the great speech and
Thank you.
Thank you for